Hello guys, today I was working on this subway scene, and I was generally going for a photorealistic look. And as you might already know, for photorealism, materials and lightings take a big effect for your photorealism in your final renders, sometimes even more than the modeling itself for the mesh. And so while working on my materials for these floors and these walls over here, I found use of the Fresnel node more than its original use for just physical accuracy and even for more artistic control over your materials, whether that be procedural materials and the PBR materials, which are these tiles over here. And today I will be talking about in general what Fresnel effect is and also about its relation with IOR and how you can use them to improve your PBRs or even your procedural materials. So if you look up what Fresnel is on Wikipedia, it describes it as something that describes the ratio between the reflection and the transmission or refraction of a light interacting with a surface, depending on the angle between the angle of incidence and the surface normal. A surface normal, as you might already know, is a vector that is tangent to your surface, or more specifically, to the tangent of the surface. So, say for example, if you have a curved surface like this, the tangent would look like this, and the normal vector would be perpendicular to the tangent like that. And what we're interested in for the Fresnel effect is between the angle of the surface normal and the angle we look at the surface from. So the angle over here. What Fresnel effect describes about it is the relation between that angle we just described over there and the reflectance of the surface. So if we take a look at the graph over here, some angle like over here, for example, this one would fall about over here because as you can see, the angle is very small and it will be close to zero. So it will fall between over here, and because so, the reflectance will be lower in general. However, if the viewing angle is over there, the angle between the surface normal and our viewing angle would be pretty high, like almost close to 90, and the reflectance will be determined to be much higher, and most of the light will be reflected off rather than refracted through. And vice versa, for this angle over here, most of the light will be refracted through and only small amount will be reflected out. And this effect actually applies not just to transmissive or transparent surfaces or materials, but it actually applies to almost all materials, even things like wood or bricks, which will be diffuse materials. As you can see, from a glancing angle, the surface, even if it's wood, it reflects the scene almost like a mirror. And this effect actually puts quite a lot of difference in photorealism for your renders, and especially for large surfaces like the ceiling or the wall of your scene. So how do you use the Fresnel effect in Blender? Well, actually, it's by default taken care for you. If you take a look at the specular tab over here, you will be able to see the IOR and the IOR level over here. You might be confused why there are two different IORs here, and that is because the IOR over here would be the physical factor you will be wanting to looking for. So, for example, the glass, as you might already know, the IOR for glass is 1.45. This is the factor you would search online to get the physical accurate value, and the one on this specular tab over here, it's a factor for more artistic purposes. So what this does is basically the IOR range would be often between somewhere like 1.1 to 1.8 something, which is pretty hard to determine because it doesn't change linearly, and you in general don't have too much control over it. And so Blender gives you an option with the IOR level factor over here. And originally, by tweaking the IOR directly, would change the form of the entire curve. This of course isn't accurate, and it will tweak it in ways you will not be able to predict too well. Like it might tweak it like this, or it will tweak it like that. It is in general pretty hard to predict, and for values like that, it's pretty hard to make artistic decisions, while it is easy to just plug in the physical values. So what IOR level does is it retains the entire look or the general look of the curve, but it affects the specularity or the reflectance at the start of the curve. So adjusting the IOR level would be equivalent to adjusting the curve kind of like this. And it's in a range between 0 and 1, which is much more manageable than range between 1.1 and 1.8 that also doesn't scale linearly. So you can think of it as the IOR over here as the physical value that you want to align and want to plug in to be physically accurate, and the IOR level over here to be the one for artistic decisions. The reason why it is in the specular tab is because it is mostly for specularity adjustments. You want to control the amount of light that's being reflected, not just the amount that gets scattered through the roughness. So more IOR level means more light will be reflected. Less IOR level means that in general, less light will be reflected because the curve will be tweaked down over here. And when you tweak the IOR level to be greater than 0.5, then it will be higher than the physical accurate curve that looked like this. Now that's how, in general, Blender takes care of Fresnel. It will determine the form of the Fresnel curve from the IOR you've provided. And what the Fresnel node will do is it's easier to see visually. And if we take a look at this example over here, I've made a scene with a very long hallway surface. And if you add a Fresnel node and just plug it into the output, you can see that it actually responds dynamically to your position in the viewport. So if you take a look at like that, since the angle between your viewing ray and the surface normal is pretty high over here, it's gonna be closer to 1. However, if it's over here, it will be close to 0, and because you can see that it's much darker. So usually what people will do is, not what people will do, what Blender would do is actually, depending on the Fresnel curve determined from the IOR level, it will adjust the specularity of the materials. So light that's over here, for example, the specularity will be much higher, determined by the Fresnel curve, which is in turn determined by the IOR level provided. However, the specularity will be lower by over here. And this is done by default by Blender if you use Principled BSDF or any kind of BSDF. However, you can actually use it for more than specularity. We can use Fresnel for more than just the reflectance or the specularity of the material, and that is surface normal imperfections. If you take a look at building, like for these windows over here, it's actually, if you think about it, it is supposed to be perfectly flat. However, in the real world, that is never actually the case. Things aren't perfectly straight, even if you plan to do it so. And if you take a look at some photos, like this one, you can see that the imperfections of the angle of the surface gets actually more noticeable depending on the angle you view the surface from. So say, for example, this was the surface for the building. And if you take a look at it from over here, then the angle of incidence will be very low because the surface normal will be like over there and theta would be tiny. But if you were looking at it like this from the below over here, the angle of incidence gets pretty high. And so in angles like these, you will be able to see that the imperfections are much more noticeable. And what we can do is we can actually make those surface imperfections dependent on the Fresnel node. So how do we do that? Well, for the material I've used over here, the windows from my initial renders, the reflections were almost perfect, which is not photorealistic at all. We want some imbalances on the surface normals. And usually you would use something like displacement map or some normal map to displace it. But if you're trying to keep things procedural, more applicable, you can actually just do it with Fresnel node. As you can see, like over here, where the imperfection should be low, the factor that the Fresnel node outputs is pretty low. However, over here, it's pretty high, which is exactly what we want surface normal imperfections intensity to be. So what I did for my material over here is get a noise texture and get the normals from the original model or the original mesh, which are just the default normals, and mix those vectors together. And the thing you should pay attention to is you should plug in the color of the noise texture instead of the factor of it, because we want a vector outputted here, and the factor is just a floating point number. It's just a single number, but the color over here, if you just plug it over here, you'll just get random color, right? And these color, which are RGB, can be just converted into XYZ, and that will give us a vector that points in a random direction. And we can just mix that with our normals, like our default normals, and we want to mix it depending on the Fresnel vector, and we do need to map range. Like, we don't want complete chaos over here, because this noise texture over here is not physically accurate, and mixing it by too much, like 100%, it will look off, and we don't want that. So we should have a map range node and that into the vector over here. And since our Fresnel value will be higher over here and lower over there, the closer the factor is to 1, it will output B, which is a noise texture. So over here will be the random vectors, but the ones close over here would be the accurate vectors. And that's how I implemented the surface imperfections for this one, for the panels over here. And for the floors, I've actually made the noise textures scale actually higher, and from that I got this very displaced reflections, which was really photorealistic and which I liked a lot about. Like, see over here, the white reflections over here are much more randomized, and using a displacement map for this would have taken forever, and you would have needed a pretty good PBR to make this effect. And the fact that you can do this procedurally was, I thought, was pretty neat. And let me actually show you the before and after for these two. This is the before, which the reflections over here are very noticeable, and they take quite a lot of effect for your photorealism in your final renders. And to wrap things up, first of all, the IOR will determine the shape of your Fresnel curve depending on the physical accurate version of your IOR, and then tweak the first point of your Fresnel curve depending on the IOR level provided in the principal BSDF specular tab. And by default, it will only affect the reflectiveness or the specularity of the surface. However, you can use that for your materials to put more imperfections on further surfaces and put less imperfections on closer surfaces, so that your materials don't actually look weird on close-up shots. And you can do that by sending the Fresnel factor through a map range and using that as the mixing factor between the random normals and your original normals, and plugging that into the normals can give you effects like these, which are pretty good surface reflections. So that's about all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed, and this is my first video, so future me might actually regret posting this publicly, but I will do so anyways because I don't know, just wanted to talk about it. Thanks for watching, and have a good time making your materials, I guess. I really should make a outro line or something.